Every 2 years, the California High-Speed Rail Authority is required to submit an updated business plan. What are the biggest challenges confronting the high-speed rail project, and does the newest business plan make the changes necessary to make the vision a reality? We'll ask Tom VanHeeke with the California Legislative Analyst's Office, John Coupal with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and Tom Richards, the Vice Chair of the High-Speed Rail Authority Board.
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. High-speed rail was first endorsed by the voters in 2008. What is the project's current status and what is the plan going forward? Our guest is Tom VanHeeke, an expert in the high-speed rail project with the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst's Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So Tom, can you give us a quick overview of the high-speed rail project?
Certainly. The high-speed rail project proposes to construct a high-speed rail system connecting San Francisco to Anaheim via the Central Valley and Los Angeles. Trains on that system would run in excess of 200 miles per hour. To design and build this, the legislature established the High-Speed Rail Authority. That's a state entity in 1996. And then in 2008, the voters of the state approved Proposition 1A. That approved $10 billion in bond funding, to partially fund construction of the project.
Yeah, it was interesting when I was reading some of the stuff that you've written. It talks about electric trains capable of operating. Right. Capable. I mean, not necessarily they're going to go 200 miles an hour, but they have to be capable of doing that. So. Right. The project is divided into two phases. Can you briefly explain the two phases?
Sure. So phase one of the project is what we were just talking about, connecting San Francisco to Anaheim. That's about 500 miles.
And can we call it LA?
Sure.
Close enough.
Close enough. Phase two, which is sort of more conceptual at this stage, would extend the system to Sacramento in the north and to San Diego in the south. Previously, the authority estimated completing phase one in 2029 at a cost of about $64 billion. And there are no estimates right now for the cost or timeline on phase two.
Okay, so phase two is just really conceptual at this point.
That's right.
Sounds like. So let's talk about the delivery plan for at least phase one. Let's focus on that. That's the San Francisco to LA, for lack of a, I know I'm short-circuiting here a little bit, but LA to San Francisco portion. So how is phase one going to be built out and at what cost? Yeah,
the authority is planning to build phase one in segments and portions, starting with the connection between the Bay Area and the Central Valley. The first full high-speed rail services would operate on that line, and you'll often hear that referred to as the initial operating segment.
And so it's kind of the valley-to-valley segment.
That's right.
But it's not high-speed rail all the way into San Francisco. I mean, they've got Caltrain, right? So
there's a Caltrain corridor there.
Blended system, they call it?
They propose to share the tracks with Caltrain between about San Jose and into San Francisco. Some of those services would probably not be running at a full high-speed
I don't see how they're going to go 200 miles. Yeah. You're not going to be zooming up the peninsula at 200 miles an hour.
There are safety concerns around that. So the trains from San Jose into San Francisco would likely run at slower speeds, sharing the tracks with Caltrain. But you get a one-seat ride from San Francisco down into the Central Valley on a high-speed rail train.
So you've got this phase one. Let's call it the LA to San Francisco. What is it going to cost to build out that segment again?
Phase one's total construction cost is currently estimated at $77 billion. That's an increase over the previous estimate, and that came out of a new business plan that was released this year.
Okay, so pretty expensive. $77 billion. Probably got people paying attention. This is remember 2008. This was a $10 billion bond measure.
That's right.
By the way, did they assume that was going to pay for the total cost?
No, the bonds are always proposed as a partial funding mechanism, and then the idea was that hopefully about a third of the funds would come from the federal government, about a third from the private sector, and about a third from the state. As it's turned out, that hasn't quite played out in reality.
Yeah, and I think if you look at this historically on major infrastructure projects around the country, typically the federal government does step in. That third wasn't unreasonable to assume, because you see like 50% sometimes.
Sometimes as much as 80 on some rail projects.
Right, yeah, so it wasn't unreasonable at the time, but politics, things change, and it's nowhere near that. So where is the money coming from then to pay for high-speed rail?
Yeah, well, so far the authority has identified three main funding sources. The first is that $10 billion we talked about. That's the bond funding approved by the voters. The second is about...
Well, let's talk about this for just a second before we run, because I know you got others, but I want to get through this a little more detail.
Sure.
So of that $10 billion, has that all been spent?
No. Actually, only a small share of it's been spent so far, maybe $2 to $3 billion to this point. So there's quite a bit left in the bank, as it were, to tap into.
Okay. Can that money be used for anything else?
So a share of the bond money is actually allocated for what are called connectivity projects. These are improvements to transit lines that would feed into the high-speed rail system.
Caltrain, maybe?
Caltrain, for example, they're a funding partner on the electrification of the Caltrain corridor in the peninsula. Otherwise, improvements to BART, for example, or LA Metro, that would feed into the high-speed rail line, which is conceived of as sort of a spine to a larger rail network in the state.
Okay, and then you got federal funds.
About $3.5 billion in federal funds. That came through the stimulus package in 2009. And then there's an ongoing stream of funds from the cap and trade program, valued at about $750 million a year on the high end. And the cap and trade program, of course, is the state's emissions reductions program. And selling permits to polluters generates funds, and those revenues are allocated accordingly by the legislature throughout the state. And
they designate 25% of those funds.
About a quarter of those funds are coming to the authority each and every year until 2030.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the bigger challenges outlined in the latest business plan in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Tom VanHeeke with the Nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst Office about the major features of the most recent business plan for the high-speed rail project. So, regarding the most recent business plan, how has it changed in terms of the scope of this thing called the initial operating segment, which is valley to valley?
That's right.
So the Silicon Valley to the Central Valley. How has that changed?
Yeah, the authority released its latest business plan in the spring of 2018, which it's required to do in every even-numbered year, and it introduced a couple of important project developments, including this scope change to the initial operating segment. So previously, the segment was to connect San Jose to Shafter, which is a community just
Shafter, I don't think people
just north of Bakersfield.
It's kind of the argument you hear from politicians that train to no disrespect to Shafter, but people are saying train to nowhere.
Yeah, there was a proposal for a temporary station in this small town. Well, now the authority wants to extend this line into San Francisco and into Bakersfield proper, so connecting larger population centers.
Right. And it's going to take a little longer, isn't it?
It is about 4 years longer now. They're assuming a launch of operations in 2020.
It doesn't take 4 years to get you from Shafter to Bakersfield, but there's other things, complications in the project.
That's
I mean, there's things, buying parcels has been a big issue. And,
utility relocation has been
they were surprised by that in Fresno,
and
that cost them some things.
That's right.
Another change was a call for interim services. What are they talking about there?
Yeah, in an effort to begin delivering mobility benefits to the state as soon as possible, the authority is now proposing to launch these early interim services on completed portions of this route as early as 2027. So this could include separate services, one in the Central Valley and one on the peninsula in the Bay Area.
So you're going to have, in a sense, you're going to have these two, one going like from Gilroy to San Jose, another one going from, I guess, what, Madera to Bakersfield or something.
Yeah, that's right.
They're not going to be connected.
They won't be connected
at that
point.
But they may be used by Amtrak or something?
Yeah, that's right. So there are currently services that operate in these areas. So Amtrak's San Joaquin service in the Central Valley, the Caltrain commuter service in the Bay Area, and they're proposing that those could be enhanced to use these new pieces of infrastructure.
Because now they're sharing, Amtrak shares it with the freight lines.
The freight lines, that's right.
So, I mean, great if you're going from Bakersfield going to Sacramento. I mean, the first half of the trip or whatever is going to be pretty fast.
Yep.
If you're in Fresno, you're only going 20 miles to Madera, not much of a difference.
Right. Those are some of the consequences potentially of that.
Yeah, but having the train go from Gilroy to San Jose, I think that would be kind of significant because of housing issues.
Yeah, it's possible that this would allow for electrified and enhanced Caltrain commuter service on that corridor, and that could be beneficial to ease some of the housing challenges in the Bay Area.
I think they see it as a potential benefit. I mean, if you ever drive those roads going to the Bay Area, and there's some people taking super long commutes,
yes,
either in from Gilroy or up from Madera, Merced into the Bay Area. These are, they're getting up at 4 in the morning.
That's right. So there could be some early benefits there.
Yeah. So the project's construction costs, those have also been revised. How?
Yes, the costs have been revised upward.
Not really surprised.
The total cost to complete construction from San Francisco down to Greater Los Angeles is now estimated at $77 billion, which we talked about earlier. That's about $13 billion higher than the previous official estimate of $64. And there are several reasons for that increase. One of which is they're now building greater contingency estimates into their projections.
More of an ish.
Exactly.
Right.
There's been some cost escalation due to these schedule delays that we're seeing. So there's inflation in the industry.
Right.
And then there are just greater costs for completing the construction that's already underway in the Central Valley.
Yeah, it's not surprising. So the funding plan, that's also changed a little bit. How has that changed?
Well, as you know, Mark, this project hasn't had a complete funding plan since its inception. It's always been in a very constrained funding environment. The authority has tried to address that in its recent business plan, and it's sketched out a funding plan that better meets its articulated needs, but it does rely on a couple of really important assumptions. The first is that the cap and trade program that we talked about earlier is extended to 2050, and then the authority...
Right now it ends at 2030.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then the authority would securitize the additional revenues from that extension. So with
that, getting a loan on
exactly
in the income. You have a job, you have a certain amount of money coming in, so you get a loan. And
they they'd bring those future revenues forward in sort of a lump sum to
right.
make some major procurements and then pay it off over time, somewhat like a loan, as you said. It's possible that would be sufficient to complete construction to Bakersfield from San Francisco, but probably not much further. And then the second assumption is that there would be additional funding available to complete that balance of construction from Bakersfield into
down to LA.
But the authority is not very clear on where that money might come from. It suggests maybe federal funds, maybe securitizing net operating revenues from the early services, but those are big question marks.
Yeah, they're not putting any dollar amounts. Okay, so what are some of the issues you think still need to be considered?
Well, the foremost issue for consideration is the fact that at this time the authority does not have a complete and viable funding plan for the completion of the project. They've secured about $13 billion in funding so far. They have that $750 million a year from cap and trade going forward to 2030, but that's simply not enough to get even the first segment of the first phase done. So the authorities propose securitizing cap and trade revenues, maybe net operating revenues in the future, but there's great uncertainty about the viability of those approaches. And it's not even clear that in the most optimistic scenarios, enough money would be generated from those approaches to actually complete the work. And that raises another important issue, which is that costs could still escalate further. The range that the authority proposes runs as high as $98 billion for completion of phase one. So ultimately, the success of this project does rely on a sort of a reliable funding commitment, and the authority just doesn't have that right now.
Okay, I want to thank Tom VanHeeke from the LAO's office. Up next, what do the critics say? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. High-speed rail is not without its skeptics. One of them is our guest, John Coupal with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Pleasure to be here.
So what do you think about the most recent business plan? Do you think it's more realistic in terms of cost estimates?
No, I think all the business plans that have been produced up to this point should be in the fiction section of the bookstore. Until we have a comprehensive audit and that audit is completed, I don't think we'll have a grasp as to what the business plan can be or should be. We opposed, as you well know, we opposed the high-speed rail project from the very beginning. In fact, even before it passed by the voters, which it barely passed in the year that Obama was elected president, we commissioned with the Reason Foundation a due diligence study, and it was co-authored by a former vice president of Amtrak, a big pro-rail guy. Every transportation expert who has looked at this said, high-speed rail may be good for Asia, may be good for Europe, can't work in California, and that's where we are right now. The federal money isn't there, the private money isn't there, the fare box revenue projections are off the chart, and the costs, of course, have
Let me ask you this. I mean, some people say that the critics are negating the fact, or at least minimizing, kind of the environmental and economic benefits. So air quality, the money coming in for economic opportunities for Central Valley, housing opportunities for people that live in Silicon Valley. Shouldn't they be part of any cost-benefit analysis?
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's talk about the greenhouse gas emissions. Remember, this project is being held on life support by the cap and trade revenue. But even LAO says that the project itself will be a net producer of greenhouse gas for the foreseeable future. And think about it, if the ridership isn't what they projected, and of course we argue and have shown that it's way off, then what you've got is a project that's producing greenhouse gases, not reducing them. So that doesn't, I mean, nothing is more productive of greenhouse gas emissions than having traffic stopped on a freeway. That's where we should be spending that money, into lane capacity and roads.
I'm going to get to that in a second. So let me ask you that. Get into that. So projections are that California's population is going to increase about 10 million people in the next 40 years. That's the size of the state of Ohio. That's a lot of people. There is a limit to how many more lanes of highway lane miles we can add, or even adding to our airports. There's a limit in terms of capacity, what we can do there. Shouldn't a comprehensive transportation system include a viable statewide passenger rail system?
Yes, and it should be a conventional rail system. We would be all in support of expanding Amtrak to Los Angeles.
You don't want to take that bus from Bakersfield to Los Angeles?
We don't want to take that. And look, I've taken the bus from, taken the train from, well, actually the bus from Sacramento to Stockton to pick up the train to Bakersfield. I like it better when you have the full train ride. Right. Not a bad experience. I've taken the Capitol Corridor down to the Bay Area. These are legitimate systems that, and we fully recognize that they will not be self-sustaining, that there's some degree of subsidy that has to happen. But the subsidy projections in order to fully implement high-speed rail, look, the fare box revenue won't cover 1% of operating costs.
So if transportation dollars are limited, we know that, right?
Right.
So what are the factors that should be considered when determining how to spend those dollars?
Well, a lot. Number one, efficiency, effectiveness. Whether or not the transportation agencies and systems we have now are being well run. Legislative analyst says that Caltrans is overstaffed.
Well, they did kind of back off that. They did say 500 million in expenditures, and they kind of backed off that recently.
Yeah, they did back off, but it's still in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, California fails to contract out much of the work that it could relative to other states. That's just one example. Regulatory red tape as it involves environmental projects. There's a lot that can be done. Caltrans in the 50s and 60s was the best transportation agency recognized worldwide. Unfortunately, Governor Brown version 1.0, when he brought in Adriana Gianturco, really destroyed that agency and it's never recovered from that.
Let me ask you this one last question. So what do you say to those who say, you know, California used to think big, aqueducts, UC, the CSU system, have we lost that capacity to think big?
No, I think there's nothing wrong with thinking big as long as you think big with planning. And when you think big without planning, what you have is the high-speed rail project.
Well, that's a good way to sum up. Thank you very much, John. Up next, what do the supporters of high-speed rail think? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about the most recent business plan for high-speed rail. We're now joined by Tom Richards, the Vice Chair of High-Speed Rail Authority Board. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So critics say that your cost estimates are still a little unrealistic and that in any event, how in the heck can you project out into the future? So how can the public trust your numbers?
Well, first of all, we're pretty satisfied with our cost estimates today in the 2018 business plan. They're certainly far more developed than they were 8 or 9 years ago when we started this, in my case, on the board. Everything that we are developing today is based upon better experience and now being under construction for 3 years. So that what I would say to you is that the numbers that we had before back then was without a lot of experience. We've got that experience. Our numbers have moved from 68.4 in 2012 to 77.1. We're not happy with that, but that's because we were better able to define the uncertainties that we didn't know in 2012.
Right. I don't know if any project, private or public, that always comes in exactly what you assume when you first start the project, right?
We would have liked to have been the first, but that wasn't in the cards.
Okay. So. Good try. Okay, so but critics also allege that the revenue projections are a bit uncertain. They're saying that, for example, that the business plan assumes that the cap and trade program is going to be extended from 2030, the current deadline, to 2050, and that high-speed rail is going to be able to leverage that money to get loans. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think perhaps it's been misunderstood. The intent of putting that in there was what would happen if cap and trade got extended to 2050. We did not assume it, and it wasn't included in the plan that we put together for 2018. It only suggests that if it was, we would be able to leverage future earnings from cap and trade and accelerate the construction of the project. And
it's kind of like the idea of it's something like buying a house, right? You use your wages to get your mortgage, and in this situation, you're using this
bonds.
Money, right, to get bonds and et cetera. Well, let me ask you this. So the most recent business plan also says that there's going to be federal funding, or could be federal funding. It's possible. Some people kind of question, why do you think the federal government's going to step in and support high-speed rail in California?
That's been a role that the federal government's played for centuries, for decades. Mm-hmm. It paid for 90% of the interstate highway system. It pays
90%?
90%. It paid for, and commonly pays for 50% or more of regional rail passenger programs like the Bay Area Rapid Transit. So it's not unrealistic to assume the federal government will eventually put more money into this project.
And what's interesting is this is one of the largest infrastructure projects, well, I think it's ever in California, maybe even in the country.
Yes.
So you would expect, historically, you'd expect the federal government to step in.
And we think that the election certainly would indicate to us that we're far more hopeful to have a bipartisan infrastructure package come through the Congress.
The most recent business plan suggests that the money necessary to complete the San Francisco to LA line could come from revenue generated from the Silicon Valley Central Valley line. Mm-hmm. Yet there's no money earmarked specifically to complete the Valley to Valley line. So, if it does get built, what net revenues are you projecting?
We're projecting that we can probably generate, based upon proving our ridership and revenue, that it could be capitalized for somewhere in the neighborhood of $7.9 to $13.7 billion.
So some money. You could generate
yes,
some money
substantial amount of money.
Okay, let me ask you the last question here. We've got about a minute left in the segment, and I just wanted to ask you about this. You know, there are a lot of people that say, or I should say, there are some people that say that this money could be better spent on other infrastructure needs. Oh, we need, you know, dams for water or housing or healthcare, et cetera. Even for transportation, they just build more highways. What's your response to that?
Well, California's got a lot of challenges, and we're capable of resolving more than one at a time. And that's what we're doing with high-speed rail.
The chewing gum and walking at the same time analogy?
We do that well in California. Transportation is a big part of economic vitality in this state and meeting the environmental goals that we've got. High-speed rail fits that bill perfectly. Well,
I want to thank our guest, Tom Richards with the California High-Speed Rail Authority, as well as Tom VanHeeke with the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, and John Coupal with the Harvard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. Thanks all of them for joining us, and thank you for joining us. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.